Hello, everybody, and welcome back for week 4 of the USFL season. I'm going to be your host today, Sean, PSU fan, Sue Newsham. Joining me is my usual partner, Alex Hardin, Fearmyturtle. Alex, how's it going on this lovely Wednesday morning?
It's going well. They've made it like a third of the way through the regular season, so let's see if they can actually finish out the year before they fold.
Yeah, so Alex was actually on, he was out. He was ruled out for today, and we, as you see, we have the USFL sort of breakdowns on things, so he's able to be here today. So Alex,
Yeah.
let's break down the Reggie Corbin situation from this weekend a little bit and talk about the reporting going on in the USFL.
I mean, yeah, the team account tweets him out as inactive a day before the game, so all of the sites with projections have him as 0 because he's not expected to play because he's on the inactive list. He's on the practice squad. And what do you know? Third play of the game, he gets a carry, and then he gets 19 more. So, I mean, rough scenes there, but what are you going to do?
It's difficult to really handle things as a content producer and projections provider that we are, and then also for you guys as the players when a guy is literally ruled inactive and then has 22 points and breaks the slate, but is probably RB1 or 2 on the slate. It's very difficult to sort of manage and navigate around that situation. So I've been very disappointed by the sort of reporting within this league. I thought the XFL was much better. It's just so different than like this is even that it's even bad compared to college, I would say. And that's saying a lot because college is terrible.
Well, I mean, at least with college, you can just take the lack of information and then do with it what you will. But this is actually sending out misinformation. So they're even doing themselves a further disservice. And really, to this point, we have a couple of key guys on this week that are coming off of injury or may come off of injury. So if you see someone like a Brian Scott as probable, how much trust can you really put into that designation that he's actually going to play? So it's definitely something to be aware of as we kind of walk into this week.
Exactly. Like, so for example, like last week, TJ Logan was moved to the inactive list. He actually was inactive. And what we saw from that was that Jordan Ellis got 25 carries and 4 targets out of the backfield. So it's a situation where you just sort of have to go with the information you have and hope that it's actually being provided correctly, which based on previous weeks is not looking like the case, but it's really all you can do. So anyways, anything else that you want to recap from last week, Alex?
No, I mean, really the name of the game, if you're playing like optimal, like head-to-heads, double ups, is you just want to minimize mistakes, really. That's the key factor. And then with tournaments, just embracing the volatility, really. I'm not saying you should be playing guys on the inactive list, but just realizing that things change week to week. We thought we had some situations figured out after 2 weeks, and then it flips again the third week. So things are constantly going to evolve, especially if teams aren't winning.
So for sure. Yeah. So last week, so we'll take a look here at quarterback. As you guys see here, Jmr Smith is the clear top end quarterback. The reason for this is Brian Scott was injured last week. He's currently listed as questionable. So Cookus actually was not terrible in the game last week. He came in and threw the ball somewhat decently. He ended up having 13 of 20 for 146 yards and a touchdown. So he had 10 points, which was not bad considering what the situation was. And then Scott had an okay game before he got hurt where he was 9 of 13 for 84 yards and a touchdown. So if you combine the two of them, they had about 18 points, which isn't the end of the world. But the one I want to talk about is the guy at the top is Jmr Smith. So he was incredibly ineffective last week. He was under 40% completion percentage. However, the thing is with Jmr Smith is he's running enough to make up for maybe some inadequacies in the air. And even in the air, he was 15 of 38 for just under 200 yards and had 2 touchdowns. So he was still productive in the air, just maybe not what you were hoping for in terms of efficiency in the air because he was just all over the place. But he's like the one quarterback that's really moving. And then the other person who I'll let you talk about is Deandre Johnston.
Yeah, so Jmr Smith, like he's been the most consistent rusher of the quarterbacks outside of maybe of like a Deandre Johnson, but Jmr is playing the whole game. I will say we need to keep an eye on Alex Magoo, who was on the inactive list again last week. If he comes back, there is some slight risk that they could give him like a series or two, but Jmr's played good enough that I think that it's his job, but there would be less certainty if Magoo was active. And then in terms of Deandre Johnson for New Jersey, they had been kind of rotating a lot the first few weeks, even like every other play. Last week, Deandre Johnson played the whole second half. So if that's something that's going to continue and we can kind of write off Luis Perez, Deandre Johnson becomes a much more viable play for us. But really, as we sit right now, I think Jmr Smith's probably the clear cash quarterback on the slate with Sloter and then whoever ends up suiting up for Philadelphia behind them. And with that uncertainty, really, I don't think I can kind of plan on playing either Brian Scott or Cookus in cash this week.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask you. Is if Brian Scott is ruled active, like how are you approaching that situation in general?
Yeah, I mean, I'd probably play some Scott in tournaments with double stacks, but I'm not approaching that with cash in terms of my one main lineup, just because he could be probable and just not play.
For sure. Yeah, and looking through some of the other quarterback situations, we did see Tuamu. He returned and played every snap this week. Again, he's not running a ton, but he did run the ball 6 times last week. So there was some running out of him last week, and he was productive both on the ground and in the air last week, and ended up with about 22 points. But looking through some of the situations, Pittsburgh is a do not touch at all for me with Love and Laletta rotating. We saw week 2, Shea Patterson got 100% of the snaps, but they were back to rotating in Lynch this week. So that's a clear do not touch for me. I would not touch Luis Perez. So that's already a good chunk of the league that is essentially like effectively out for me. Alex talked about if Deandre Johnson gets a whole game, he would be the clear QB1. In terms of like what we know so far, you pretty much have to play Jmr Smith in cash. But the upside on Deandre Johnson is better than all the quarterbacks here, would you say?
Yeah, I think so. That game could get really ugly, and actually, like New Jersey is like a pretty huge favorite considering these teams aren't great. I was kind of surprised to see such a big spread in the Jersey Pittsburgh game, but certainly his rushing floor and ceiling, like he almost got that 100 and a touchdown last week. So give him the full game, yeah.
All right, moving on to the running back position. We saw BJ Emmons was out snapped and out carried by Juwan Washington this week, which was a bit of a flip. We saw Stevie Scott get banged up, which led to the Reggie Corbin feeding that we were all expecting with him ruled out. And then we had some other situations I thought became more clear. With Logan out, Jordan Ellis just got force-fed the ball. As you see, there's a clear gap with him at the top of the projections. And it was warranted. Like he got absolutely fed the ball with Logan out. Then you have Trey Williams, who I talked about last week as my favorite running back. And then the other thing that I thought was interesting was CJ Maribel really established himself as the lead rusher along with Mark Thompson for their respective teams. But what did you think in terms of the Maribel situation and him sort of establishing himself over Tony Brooks-James?
Yeah, we talked about last week. We thought there was 3 situations where the guys were separating, Maribel, Thompson, and Groshek. It turns out Groshek kind of flipped back, and Madre London got more work. But certainly with Maribel and Mark Thompson, those two continue to separate, in my opinion. So they're squarely in the conversation. So I really think these top 4 you're looking at, Ellis, Williams, Mark Thompson, Maribel, you're probably playing at least 2 or 3, probably 3 of them in cash games. So it's a nice group. Good floors. You're seeing our running back point projections kind of go up each week as we get more confident in their role. And it's just hard to beat these guys that are getting like 15 plus carries and like 3 to 6 targets each week. Some really cheap points that like someone like a Trey Williams kind of racks up. But in terms of Maribel specifically, like we thought at the beginning of the season, he was probably the more talented runner of the two. I don't think either of us are big Tony Brooks-James fans. So it's good to see him getting the work, and kind of eventually he's probably going to plow in a few touchdowns in a game and get all of that volume on the ground in through the air. So yeah, he's definitely someone who has a pretty high ceiling.
So what is your thoughts with the BJ Emmons and Juwan Washington situation? Because before this week, it had been a BJ Emmons show. And to be fair, BJ Emmons still was the pass down target in this situation. There was no targets for Juwan Washington in this game. Obviously, with the price point, it's going to be difficult to play Emmons and anything outside of GPP. But what's your thoughts on that situation?
Yeah, for me, it's kind of like I'll play Emmons in tournaments just because I think he'll come in really low owned due to his price tag. And I still think he has that ceiling. the first few weeks we were kind of concerned that he wasn't getting any pass game work. Then last week he kind of flipped where he got plenty of pass game work, but Juwan Washington got more carries. I still think Emmons is the running back to own in this backfield, and not a huge fan of Juwan Washington like on this slate, considering like he's cheaper, but so are the top tier guys. Like salary is not important here, so I still think Emmons is the upside guy of the two and would be playing him more, but certainly not in an optimal type lineup.
So all right, so down the list a little bit here. We had Holland out for Philly, and then we saw Fat Colburn was a full participant, but then barely played on the weekend. You and I are very familiar with Colburn. I think in college he's one of the most hated running backs you've ever had because he has absolutely no talent effectively. But what we saw was Paul Terry played a boatload for Philadelphia, and I will say that if we have the same situation, Terry is the clear RB1 to me this week. It's not even close. And the reason for that is because his floor is absolutely massive with the pass game usage that he'll get. He had 9 targets last week, did absolutely nothing, had 8 catches for 52 yards, put up 15 points. If you're going to have 8 to 10 targets, it doesn't really matter what else you're going to do because they're so high percentage catch rates that you're going to get like 6 for 50 no matter what, which is a great floor and a massive ceiling. So what's your thoughts on Philly in general and the Terry situation?
Yeah, so we need to monitor the practice reports, see where Darnell Holland is. Definitely much more interested if there's only 2 running backs. So we'll see if Holland's out, can certainly play Terry or possibly Colburn. My concern would be that from the Terry perspective is that Colburn was just getting ramped up a bit. Like he played more later in the game. Ended up with like 18% snaps, I think. So if he for somehow gets like the 40% next week, that certainly cuts into Terry's load. But I think regardless, Terry's going to be this kind of Swiss Army knife type guy. Like he wasn't brought in solely just to be a ball carrier. So he's definitely, I think regardless of the situation, he's going to be a guy who gets targets. And to your point, if Holland's out and Colburn kind of maintains the same role, it's really tough not to play a guy who could get 10 targets. And in their offense, like everything is short, ADOT, just dump off. So, I mean, 6 to 8 catches and 40 to 50 yards as like a receiving floor for a cheap running back. Like that's really nice. So we'll kind of see how the injury report plays out, and we might see some projection adjustments as the week go on.
For sure. And as we've talked about, the pricing is still not there. They're just not adjusting. I don't really know what's going on with the pricing. I don't know why BJ Emmons is still the most expensive running back on the slate. I don't know why Stevie Scott is number 2. But what we find is I do think for GPP purposes, it ends up being good because I think everything's a pick 'em. So you can rotate in lots of different stuff and have it work. Whereas if pricing was more efficient, you couldn't do that. But Jordan Ellis is the clear top running back from us, despite being like the 6th to 7th priced running back on the slate. So what's your thoughts on the pricing and what we've been seeing in terms of adjustments from that perspective?
Yeah, it's just going to lead to like concentrated ownership and kind of all contest on the top few guys. Like if things are the same as we see them now and the injuries, the guys out that we expected to, like Ellis is going to be a guy pushing like 50 to 60%. Williams is going to be in that 40 to 50% range. Thompson, 35 to 45%. So like you're getting all of your ownership there, leaving guys like Emmons and Victor and Scott and Terry, like they're going to be probably underowned. So you have to make the pricing and inefficiencies kind of make you lean into some uncomfortable lineups and tournaments. But really, a guy like Terry's not going to lose to Trey Williams 85% of the time. So yeah, kind of have to take some uncomfortable risks there in tournaments, I believe.
All right, moving on to receivers. So something you talked about last week was going to be like the Philadelphia rotation at receiver. So why don't we talk a little bit about Philadelphia and what we saw last week? I actually wrote up Bug Howard. He was like one of my favorite GPP plays, and he actually put up 18 points. So hopefully a few of you guys were able to take advantage of that. But we saw Jordan Sewell was a little bit less productive last week with only 4 for 61 and only had 5 targets. So why don't we start with the Philadelphia situation and what you saw with them?
Yeah, so Sewell is the only one who played all of the snaps. So I do like him, and that's kind of where his projection's coming from. Just I think we can rely on him getting somewhat of a target share. But Howard was great. He played like I think 77% of the snaps. He was running out of the slot. He's not really a tight end in the offense. He's basically a slot receiver. Chris Rowland was back, and he barely played. I think he played around 15% of the snaps. So I think Howard is a great shout there, and he kind of fits a lineup where you're jamming in expensive guys at every position. He's only 4K. Beyond that, Devin Gray, he rotated in a bit. I think he was around a 60% snap share. Overton, I think, was mid-70s snap share. Definitely solid. So when I'm playing Philadelphia, I think I will be doing a lot of double stacks. So it's a situation where you're rotating guys in those stacks with whoever at quarterback ends up playing.
For sure. On the Michigan side, what's your thoughts on Quincy Adebayo being the most expensive receiver on the Michigan team?
Yeah, he's definitely on the inactive list. I don't expect him to play this week, seeing that he's not on the team, but who knows? I'm sure he'll be there in week 10 also at 8,500 on DraftKings. So, yeah. Lance Lenoir, he's been kind of the market share and air yards god so far and hasn't really hit yet, but it's probably coming at some point on the Michigan side. So if you're looking for a Michigan pass catcher to kind of maybe bring back on those Philly double stacks, I certainly think Lenoir's your guy. And then you have New Jersey up right now. Like, this is just kind of a stay away for me. They're going to get the ball in Turpin's hands, but they want to run the ball. It's tough to stack receivers with their quarterback, considering their primary quarterback wants to run the ball a lot. I do think Shepard is interesting at 4,500 just because he's been running a lot more routes the last few weeks, had a big target game 2 weeks ago. So he's somewhat interesting.
Yeah, and like looking at the New Jersey team, like you see Turpin is the highest projected at 6.5, and everyone else is like under 4.5 points. So we're not expecting much from the New Jersey pass game in general in that situation. Moving on to Pittsburgh, last week we saw Bailey Gaither not play for Pittsburgh. What is your thoughts on this situation, and what's your thoughts on what happened with Gaither last week?
Yeah, Gaither's just kind of it was another one. Just there's nothing on him, and then all of a sudden he just doesn't play. And there was some chatter that he was sick or something, but there was no news on it, no report. So see what comes out this week. Assuming that he plays, he probably steps back into a pretty solid role for them. But if he doesn't play, you saw Trey Walker lead them in snaps. He certainly gets a boost, as does Brandon Mack. But I mean, I think in a good game script, this team wants to run the ball. However, they are projected to be they're the biggest dog on the slate, so I think they will be forced to throw. The issue is their quarterbacks. They're probably going to be rotating, and they have a pretty solid rotation at receiver as well, especially if everyone's healthy. So it's not really a team to get too excited about, but I could see playing them kind of as one-offs, and I'd probably go back to Gaither if he was a full go in tournaments, but certainly not on my cash game list this week.
No, I think it's a really good point with Gaither. Like, I think a lot of people will shy away from him due to what happened last week. You could probably play him in GPPs and get him at a pretty reduced ownership. And in my opinion, like, he's got huge upside. Like, he's a guy that can go downfield and really produce. So I think that I would definitely consider playing him in that format. All right, moving on to Tampa Bay. Again, you see another team with not much production here, realistically. We have John Franklin, who is getting some rushing volume. He had 6 targets last week, had a few carries as well, replicated effectively what he did in week 2, actually even expanded on it a little bit. And then we do still have Cheyenne O'Grady, who we've seen come back down to earth a bit after his early season 11 target game in week 1. So what's your thoughts on Tampa Bay? There's not much there. For me, it's Franklin, really, if you want anyone at cheap guy, but his stuff's all going to be short yardage, and you're not really going to get tons of production there.
Yeah, Tampa Bay's tough to play because, like, Franklin's taking some Wildcat snaps, which makes you not want to play Tamu. You don't want to stack Franklin necessarily with Tamu because he's getting a lot of his production, well, some of it through the ground, even though he is, I think, led them in snap share in terms of wide receiver. And then Dylan was the second guy, I think, at like 75%. So, I mean, they're rotating receivers, which makes it tough. So it's pretty spread out. You saw Dylan catch, I believe he caught a long touchdown last week. So something like that certainly could happen, but definitely a single stack team for me, and not too excited to play any of these guys as kind of one-offs. And you have Derek Willis at the bottom, probably the biggest USFL bust so far this season.
Yeah, he was supposed to be a wide receiver 1 for them and be pretty productive, and it's just not been the case. All right, on to the Birmingham team, who's had a really productive offense. Again, we talked about Victor Bolden. We've seen him up there each and every week as one of, if not the top receivers. This guy has 33 targets through 3 games. So why don't you talk a little bit about Bolden here?
Yeah, Bolden's just a starting point in cash games. Like nobody else at the receiver position is getting the type of volume week in, week out with him. Yes, a lot of it's low A dot, but he did get in the end zone last week, and you can't beat the target the targets. So you just kind of have to start your lineup with that. Salary is not a huge issue. So Bolden, wide receiver 1 for me this week. However, he's going to be extremely high owned. I think we're looking at probably in the 40% range in tournaments. So in large field stuff, probably want to look at some pivots, like someone like Osiris-Mitchell, who got a 0 last week, but he still played most of the snaps. He had been productive the week before, more of a boomer bust. So if you get an ownership discount on Mitchell, definitely interested in that as a tournament pivot. And then Marlon Williams, he is a different kind of receiver here in the USFL than we're used to. We're used to him just getting jammed kind of targets in the slot, high catch rate stuff. Here, like he's getting like 5 or 6 targets a game and catching like 1 or 2 of them for long touchdowns. So different Marlon. He's kind of interesting though. So you could play Jmr and like double stack him with Mitchell and Marlon, but it's tough when so much of the market's going to Bolden. So the good thing about the Birmingham wide receivers is that they're all playing most of the game. So there's not a heavy rotation situation. And I would certainly X off like Darius and Ramsey who are playing like 10% of the snaps, if that.
Now, in GPP, would you consider Xing out Victor Bolden due to GPP ownership?
I would consider going under the field on him, but I think you still want to play him in a lot of your Jmr stacks and get different with that second guy. Someone like you could play Kerry Angeline with him, or either of the other 3 are going to be much lower owned. So I'm fine playing Bolden in tournaments, especially with Jmr.
Yeah, so Osiris-Mitchell, we saw him obviously have 0 points last week and didn't produce at all. What's your thoughts on him from a GPP perspective?
Yeah, Osiris is a great play. He's going to play on the outside. He's going to get those down the field looks. So yeah, we saw him catch a touchdown the first 2 weeks. So if people are going to be off of him now that he came in with a 0 last week, they maybe didn't even know if he played or not, and they are avoiding him. Certainly want to get back on Osiris-Mitchell this week.
All right, moving on to Houston. We have a couple wind sprinters on this team. What's your thoughts on them from GPP perspective?
I think Zuber maintains to be like one of the better tournament pivots off of someone like a Bolden at the same price range. He's severely overpriced, but he's someone who can get down the field and have big plays. And Tyler Simmons is interesting to like that Bug Howard range pivot. Simmons has played mid 70% snaps, and pretty good targets so far. So I would consider either one of them. I certainly wouldn't be. I think I'm off of Houston double stacks. Like the quarterback play is just pretty rough there.
All right, and then what about Houston with Johnny Dixon and Sean Poindexter being the most expensive guy there?
Yeah, I think New Orleans, Dixon's establishing himself as one of the better options. He's kind of like the same mold as Bolden in that he's running out of the slot, getting a lot of volume each week. I think he had a 2 touchdown week last week, so he's certainly one of the better plays on the slate. I do think it's a great bounce back spot for Jonathan Adams at 4,300. He played most of the game, got some targets. He only caught 1 ball this week, but he still led them in air yards. So he's getting those high value down the field looks, and it's just a matter of time before they connect again. So certainly back on the Adams train. So someone like if Adams, Osiris-Mitchell, those kind of guys are going to be going under owned this week, certainly want to go over them in MME runs. Poindexter is not somebody, if he's getting any ownership whatsoever, he's somebody that I'll happily fade on this slate. But if you can get him for 5%, he's worthwhile, especially in some slower stacks.
For sure. And then also someone that we talked about after week 1 was Sal Cannella. Cannella really got a solid production and target volume again last week with 10 targets. He's someone I think is a little bit under the radar that is getting volume in a few games so far.
Yeah, and it's probably just me being a little biased against tight ends in general when you don't have to play them. And it probably goes back to us playing college football DFS. You're not usually looking to jam in tight ends when you don't have to, but he certainly is viable. In this offense.
For sure. And then on the defensive side of the ball, It's going to go the same way that we've talked about. They're all going to be jammed together. Would you agree? Still, I can't see a situation all year where we change our opinion here and say don't sprinkle or something. Do you?
Yeah, you just don't want to be playing defenses into ownership and tournaments just because anything can happen, really, especially when we don't have a great feeling for these teams and their personnel, and a lot is changing each week. You just don't want to be jamming in the highest owned defense in all of your lineups. With that said, I do think the Generals defense is probably the best defense on the slate for your optimal lineups. Pittsburgh has the lowest team total. They're the biggest underdog. They want to run, but they're going to be forced into throwing, which is an ideal situation to rack up sacks and interceptions. And I will say, we say all this stuff about the Pittsburgh team wanting to run the ball. They have like the second or third highest pass rate in the league so far. So I think they are willing to pass when needed after that week one disaster kind of changed their tune a bit.
All right. And then from a sort of value perspective, where are you really looking for value between running back and receiver and quarterback situation this week?
Yeah, so my favorite kind of value play at receiver is probably going to be going back to Jonathan Adams at 3,800. And let's see who else is down there. You have Bug Howard is another great play. I would certainly be in my pool. Overton's fine, but I prefer Bug Howard and Adams in terms of value at wide receiver. And then Tyler Simmons would be the fourth guy in that pool. I think he'll go a bit under owned this week.
Yeah, and then for running backs, I really like Paul Terry. We talked about, obviously you need to follow the news, whatever you get, and hope that it's accurate. But if we have the same situation as last week, Terry's RB1 for me. I would play him over everyone here, maybe except for Jordan Ellis, but he would be an RB2 at worst for me. And then so we look at running back here. I think Ellis is going to be really highly owned. I think it's going to be warranted, though. I think that makes sense on him being highly owned. I think Trey Williams will be pretty high owned as well. What are some of your thoughts on some guys, maybe like in the Mark Thompson and Maribel range compared to those guys?
Yeah, so most people are going to probably start with Ellis and Trey Williams, and then that only leaves like one other running back you can play in that lineup. So some of these guys a bit down the list are going to get squeezed. Like it's going to happen. So I think Maribel will be the one that will get overlooked. Just Thompson coming off that huge game, especially that long touchdown in the end, put up a really big box score. So I think Maribel is the best of the group that will begin to get overlooked. Like I think if you can get someone like him at under 20%, that's a great play because he can be competitive with all of them at the top. And certainly Terry will probably go overlooked a bit just because you don't need the savings, and he's not going to project from a median perspective as well as the other guys. I think he'll shoot up a bit if we get news that Holland's going to be out or Colburn's still limited whatsoever. But yeah, I think your boy Terry will come in pretty low owned this week.
What's your thoughts in terms of roster construction from both cash game perspective and from the GPP options?
Yeah, so I mean, where we're at right now with this week, it's certainly going to be a 3 running back week for me for cash games. However, might kind of force that down to a max 2 in tournaments just because I think so many people will be jamming in these running backs. And I still think where it's won is these high upside wide receivers. So probably be a situation where in cash, I'm certainly playing 3 this week, but in tournaments, we'll be more willing to go down to 1 and 2 running backs.
Definitely. All right, that's going to wrap it up for us today. Alex, is there anything else that you think we have missed to help everyone on this weekend?
No, we'll be in the Discord. Any news that comes out, be updating projections. We'll probably get the projected ownership and tags out and by Friday. Consider hopefully we get some practice news. We haven't got anything out of these teams yet this week, so should be coming updates. Fill the contest, and we have an 80K this week. Let's fill that so we can keep that steady throughout the rest of the year. And good luck on week 4.
For sure. All right, everyone. That's going to wrap it for us this week. Good luck to you guys. Make sure you come back next week for week 5. Let's hope we get through the entire season. I think we're due for one of these leagues to actually knock out an entire season. So anyways, for Alex, I am Sean. Good luck, everyone, this week. We will see you next week.